So Draw.io is a nightmare. Okay, not really, but sometimes it can be a pain in the butt. The thing is, it's still one of the most accessible and easy to use tools that an architect has to create diagrams, short of using an actual whiteboard. That said, Draw.io's quirks can be off-putting enough to discourage architects from learning how to use it. So I want to go over some of these quirks and show you how to get around them. Okay, so let's talk about this infinite canvas thing. I'm going to hit the space bar and I'm going to drag the cursor around, and you can see that they size the canvas to like a fixed page thing. And I never really use this, and it's kind of annoying. So let's take care of that first. The first thing we do is we're going to go to view, and then we're going to deselect page view. So now it's an infinite canvas. The next thing you're going to want to do is figure out how to zoom in and out. And you could use these little magnifying glasses by clicking on it again and again, zooming in, zooming out. Or what you can do is you can just hold the control button down and then use the wheel on your mouse and scroll in and out. And that's a lot easier. So now you can kind of navigate around the canvas. So let's do a little drawing. If you're an architect, you're going to want to use UML. So you're going to find some of the basic artifacts. You got your actor and your use case. So let's use that. And just like a lot of drawing tools, you can just kind of click and drag it out there. Now, maybe what you want to do is have this activity arrow go from the actor to the use case, but it's a little ugly. It's jagged. You want a straight line. So what you want to do is modify the style. Now, if it's already open, you just click on the style button. But if it's not, there's this little toggle right here in the corner. You just click on that and it flies out. Another way to get there is you can go into the view and click format. So to get the line to be straight, what I like to do is you go here and select a straight line. If you want it to be a dotted line, you can select one of these styles. And in UML, arrowheads actually have a meaning. So I like to be very particular with what arrowheads I'm using. In this case, I want an open arrowhead. And there you go. Now watch what happens if I try to repeat that. It gets jagged again, and that's kind of annoying. So what you can do is you can click on the arrow and then find this set as default style button and click on that. Once you've clicked on it, then you can just drag out another line. Another way to do that is to right click on the line and select set as default style. Now, one of the most powerful artifacts in UML is the stereotype. And this is a way to specify what kind of object is in your diagram. It removes ambiguity. Now, what I'd like to do is double click on this dotted line and add an include stereotype, because this save a document use case is included as part of the create a document use case. Now, what I want to do in UML, they have those angled quotes. They call those guillemets. They kind of look like this. Now, the thing is, I just used 2 angle brackets, and that might be fine, but that's not the right character, and it takes up a bunch of additional space. So another trick that you can do is you can grab one of these UML interface boxes, and it already has a stereotype in it, and you can just kind of copy and paste it. Much easier. You see those guillemets characters or double angled quotes. And you just delete this. Now, let's say I wanted to take this arrow and hook it onto this object down here that I just created. There's a couple ways you can do it. Some people like to put it right on the edge, and you wait till the bubble turns green. And that's a little challenging because as you move it, it doesn't always line up right. Other folks like to highlight the arrow and sort of find these anchors. There's a handful of anchors on the edge of the object. You could do that. But again, it gets a little weird if you kind of move the bubble around. It doesn't stay centered. So an even easier way to do this is grab the arrow and drag it into the middle of the object until the object has this light blue halo around it, and then let go. And now when you move it, the arrow stays kind of centered. And it's the same problem when you're trying to attach an arrow or action line from the actor. You might be tempted to just kind of drag the arrow right up to the, then it looks like an extended foot. That doesn't look really good. Same thing, just kind of drag the mouse until the character or actor gets highlighted in blue, and then it sort of gets anchored to the edge of the object, and that's much cleaner. Sometimes you want to put a whole lot of text inside of an object, but that's just too much. So there's a couple things you can do. If it's a reasonable amount of text, you can just kind of do a soft return. So you hold Shift and Enter, and you can control the carriage return so that there's enough breathing room. But in this case, there's too much text, so you can just select it, and you go over here to the text, and you can change the font size. That's still a bit too much, so we'll make it go smaller. Now, in this case, maybe instead of reducing the size of the text, you can also increase the size of the object. But the problem with that is when you change the size of the object, then it starts to look inconsistent. And then people reading your document say, why is this bubble bigger than this? Does that make this bubble more important than that bubble? So you should always try to target having your bubbles and objects being the same size unless you're trying to emphasize it for a specific reason. Now, usually if there's too much text in a single object, and maybe that's a sign that it should be written in a more concise way.
Now, when you're dealing with a bunch of different objects that have a bunch of different styles, sometimes it's just easier to copy and paste.
Now, Draw.io has some neat functionality that makes it easy for you to stylize it for easier reading. You don't want to be sloppy with your layout because that just makes things hard to read and it doesn't look as professional. It's nicer if you have consistent spacing. So you can see these little center lines appear if you want to line something up. And also as you get closer, you can see the little spacing is there. So it encourages an even spacing between your objects. Now, sometimes you want to insert an object between two other objects, and Draw.io lets you do that. You can just take the new object and drag it over the line until the line becomes purple. And when you let go, you can see that it split the line in half, and there's two separate lines, and they're using the same style. Sometimes it's hard to grab an object, so you can just zoom in, again, holding the Control key and use the wheel button on your mouse, and then select the object you want, and then zoom out. Now, in this case, I'm creating a use case diagram, and when we figure out the subject that's going to own the responsibility of these use cases, we like to put a subject box around it. Now, they don't really have a subject box in this UML. So what I like to do is just take this interface box and I'll tweak it a little bit. Now, that's not going to be good with the text in the middle. I'm going to send that to back. And I'd like that label to be up in the top corner. So the way you do that is you select the object, the text tab, align to the top, align to the left. Now, I'm a little picky. I like my margins to be consistent. So I want my left margin to match my top margin. And the way you can do that is under the spacing area on the text tab, you just add it about 5 points. I find 5 points is about the same as what they have by default. If you have wrapping text, you're going to want to do it on the left and the right. Another element that's really common in UML is the note. So just like stereotypes can be used to tell you what something is, you can add a note to any element to reduce ambiguity. A good way to create a note is to go under the General tab, find that little paper or file icon. I like to make it yellow because it makes me think of a sticky note. That's optional. Now, sometimes the note can be rather long and it's better to have it aligned to the left and sort of flow. Again, you can go to the text tab after clicking on the box, have the text aligned to the top and to the left. In this case, with the spacing, we'll give it a 5-point left margin and a 5-point right margin. And you can kind of size it down and it should flow. Now you notice this little annoying thing where the word is running into the fold. In this case, I like to do a soft return by hitting Shift Enter. And now it's a little easier to read. Now, typically, you're going to want to extend a single dotted line from the note to the object that you're denoting. Again, you can go to the Style tab, change your line style to a dotted line, go to the arrows and select None. And that's always useful. Now, sometimes it's a little difficult to get the arrows to show up for an object that you want to extend an arrow from. In that case, you can just select on the parent box and just drag a line over, and then take that anchor point of the line and then hook it to the object that it's coming from. Now, in this case, it likes to put it in the background. So you just right click on the arrow and go to front. It's hit or miss. Sometimes when you mouse over, you get those nice little blue arrows and it's easy to drag something out. Other times, if you have a very highly nested document, it's hard to find the blue arrows. Now, again, if you're nesting boxes because you have subcomponents or sub-subjects or whatever, you want to take advantage of the bring forward, send backwards, to front, to back functionality. And from there, you can align it for easier reading. Now remember, you want to have breathing room between your elements. Now, sometimes it takes a little practice to be able to select multiple objects at the same time. When I do this, you might think that those three bubbles are going to get selected, but that's not the case. Only the stuff that was completely covered by that selection gets selected. If I want to select all three bubbles, I have to shoot past it. So always overshoot your selection. And if when you overshoot, you accidentally grab too many things, like in this case, I grabbed those little stereotypes, you can hit Shift and click on them to deselect them. And now I only have the object selected that I want to work with. Now, sometimes while you're working, you can get a little lost. The best way to find yourself is hold down that Control key and use your mouse wheel and zoom all the way out. Then you can see, oh, I'm up here and I want to be down here. Holding down the Space key,
You can center yourself and then zoom back in. That's much easier than moving around and hoping you find your way. Zoom out, zoom in.
Now, sometimes you want to add a complicated set of objects into your diagram, and it's a little hard to get everything aligned. Maybe it tries to group it with a parent object that you don't want to do. In that case, what I recommend is take the parent objects and move them to the side, like this. Now you have some elbow room, and you can work on the child objects directly. Once you have the child objects where you want them to be, then you go one by one through each of the nesting objects and realign them so that they contain all the child objects with enough elbow room. Now, if you're having trouble using the mouse to position things exactly where you want them to be, maybe the grid is acting a little too aggressive, you can use your arrow keys to nudge objects.
So here I'm tapping the arrow key 1 pixel at a time until the object is positioned right where I want it to be.
Now, just as we were able to select a bunch of objects for modification before, we might want to be able to select a bunch of objects for deletion. So the same thing applies. Don't try to select all the objects like this. That could be very time consuming. Instead, take your cursor and drag around everything that you want to delete, but try to exclude the objects you don't want to delete.
Here you can see they're all selected. You can hit the delete key.
Now I want to show one more example of how to deal with composite objects. Sometimes this Draw.io tool likes to give you objects that they're made up of multiple sub-objects, and it's a little hard to work with. A great example of where that happens is when you're trying to note actual components like DLLs or jar files. Now, this nifty little widget was created with the idea that you're always going to keep the ball and socket connected, but that's not always how we want to use it. And as you can see, look at what a pain it is when I try to drag it. Just bent it all out of shape. Sometimes it's easier to just zoom in until you get the move icon. Look at what a pain it is to work with these composite controls. You have to select it just right so you can move everything together. Maybe you'll just want to drag the ball and socket to the object and center it.
Now that's great for simple diagrams.
Here we're representing the required interface with a socket, and we're representing the provided interface with the ball. Sometimes it's called a lollipop. But sometimes you have more complicated diagrams that you want to illustrate the UML 2.5 convention with an arrow between. And all you want to do is have the socket further up here and the ball up here. Now that takes a lot of wrangling. Sometimes it's easier if you just work with them separately. So in this case, I can delete the parts I don't want, and then I can position them as needed. It's always much easier to just create a new object and work with it separately rather than trying to wrangle all the little pieces. In this case, I have a component and maybe it has two required interfaces. We'll draw that. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. In UML 2.0, we like to have a dotted arrow going down from the required interface to the provided interface to represent that runtime dependency. So I could just drag an arrow right off of it and hook into that lollipop like that. And then I can kind of position it, and that looks kind of good. We'll change the style to a dotted line. And I'll copy and paste it and try to do the same thing here. Now this gets annoying. You'll notice that the grid doesn't really have an intersection that aligns in the middle with this socket. So what do? In this case, select the arrow and nudge it with your arrow keys. What I found is it takes 5 taps to get into the middle of a cell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once it's moved over, then you just simply go to this endpoint and drag it to the lollipop. And it's nice and centered. Now it is a bit cumbersome because these arrows don't actually anchor to the socket because the convention is that it comes from this empty space. So if you have to move the component around, you'll need to adjust it again. Now this might be good enough for you. Don't let perfect get in the way of good enough. But if you're like me, you get a little bit picky. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you drag it. Now, some of these tricks might seem a little bit hokey or cumbersome, but I really recommend that you just get used to it and kind of embrace the limitations of Draw.io. And once you do that, you can focus on just getting faster and focus on the actual nomenclature of your diagramming, whether that's C4 or UML. And really, you want to focus on communicating your architecture design and not get slowed down by the tool.